The meeting is called to order. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Let me wish you a warm welcome to Geneva and to the fourth session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. It is both a responsibility and a privilege for my country to have been asked to chair this conference, a role that shows our engagement and enthusiasm towards promoting disaster risk reduction. I would like to thank UNISDR and Mrs. Margareta Wallström in particular for the trust they have invested in the government of Switzerland. I am convinced that in putting together this fourth session of the Global Platform, UNISDR has set the stage for good discussions that will carry the disaster resilience agenda beyond 2015. Allow me to highlight the important role played by each and every one of you, bringing in a tremendous wealth of knowledge and expertise. You are the moving force that has brought the disaster resilience roadmap forward. It is a commendable achievement to have brought disaster risk reduction to front and center of the international agenda and to have attained the necessary momentum to shed light on these issues in the discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals. It is paramount now to highlight the central role of communities in building resilient nations, the inclusion of the private sector in building resilient societies, and the importance of local and national governments in securing sustainable risk management. It is our privilege today to foster the right political, economic and social conditions for states and communities to develop and adapt their own risk management mechanism. The Hyogo Framework for Action provides conclusive guidance towards achieving these objectives in the long run. I wish you all an enriching and productive fourth session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. I now declare open the fourth session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. I would now like to invite the President of the Swiss Confederation, Mr. Ueli Maurer, to make an opening statement. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Monsieur le Président de la Plateforme mondiale,
Chairman of the World Platform, Global Platform, Vice Chair, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, allow me to welcome you in Geneva. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to bring you the greetings of the Swiss government. I wish you every success for this fourth session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm absolutely certain that the spirit of Geneva will contribute to this success, because in order to succeed, what is important is finally motivating environment and a good spirit. I'm sure that Geneva will give you this very favorable framework because of the spirit of this international and humanitarian city is there, and Geneva is a very important city for fruitful discussions. It's a city of diplomacy and peace. We provide a neutral territory and give you the assurance as a small state that we do not wish to impose our military or political ambitions on anyone. The United Nations office in Geneva is the most multilateral centre in the world. Historical negotiations have been held here. Geneva also has a large number of UN agencies and other international organizations, as well as NGOs and other international organizations, as well as academic organizations. Thanks to this international situation, Geneva is a center of world governance of the first order and deals with many different issues such as peace, security, disarmament, human rights, humanitarian action, work, economics, telecommunications, health and the environment, as well as sustainable development. By welcoming, among others, the Secretariat of International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction of the United Nations, which organizes this conference, Geneva is also a center of competence regarding the reduction of disaster risks. During the next few days, we are going to be speaking about disasters, risks, and security, as well as safety. We must never forget a basic principle in this context. Safety is not something which comes without any payment. It's not free. Risks, dealing with risk, costs. We have to do it in a targeted manner, because if we invest in favor of the risk reduction, it allows us to save lives and to guarantee subsistence means as well as save public and private means. We must make an additional effort and use in an optimal fashion all the resources. It is the governments, but also private organizations and the civil society that needs to contribute. In our world, the consequences of disasters are now global. We are very quickly involved, all of us, at least from the economic point of view. When there is an earthquake somewhere, the stock markets are also trembling. That is why it would be wise for us to reduce the risks together, and we will in this way contribute to our common safety and well-being. It is also essential to draw conclusions and lessons from the work carried out in the Hyogo framework, which lasts until 2015, in order to promote the resilience of populations in the face of disaster. An international DRR system after 2015 would allow us to reinforce the situation and the present framework. Cooperation in the disaster risk reduction has to be also reinforced in order to have an effective disaster risk reduction system, which is global. Switzerland is committed to setting up such a system, and this would allow us to measure in a more effective way the progress that has been made. And finally, I would like to look towards the future beyond this meeting here in Geneva. I think it's very important to consider a reduction of disaster risk in a more global context. Finally, we need to have an integrated management which also involves the environmental components. In addition, resilience in times of disaster has to be looked at in a cross-cutting way and needs to be a development objective at the national, regional and global level. To adopt such a perspective will allow us to better coordinate strategies in the area of climate change, of food safety, and in the management of natural resources in the long term. There is a lot of work before us, but we are on the right path, I'm absolutely certain. I wish you great pleasure and energy in carrying out this task. I hope that this meeting will be very successful and will be inspired by the spirit of Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Jan Eliasson, the United Nations Deputy Secretary General, to make his remarks. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, a very warm welcome to all of you. And I want to thank you for coming to Geneva and bringing your expertise to the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. Across the United Nations system, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and his team are trying to foster a culture of resilience. We know from bitter experience that waiting for catastrophe to strike before acting is not tenable and is not morally acceptable. Let me use a metaphor. There is very little a fire engine can do when you send it to a house that has already burnt down. But if you fortify the house, if you check it often and keep it up to standards, you may not need a fire engine at all. This session is a global forum where partners can meet. I'm impressed to see here such a great diversity of participants, representatives from national and local governments, NGOs, civil society, the private sector, international organizations, parliamentarians, scientists, and academics. Truly impressive. It shows the cross-cutting nature of disaster risk reduction. All of you are key to building resilience to disasters and making our communities safer. This is our collective and our shared responsibility. I was recently in Japan early this year, and it has been 2 years since the triple disasters, the earthquake, the tsunami, and the nuclear accident at Fukushima. The area was still marked by the devastation when I was there, but the people were in the midst of rebuilding. I visited an elementary school in the city of Ishinomaki. The structure had been hurt, but the children showed great strength and hope for the future. They had endured shocks and suffering, losing their parents, neighbors, and friends. The people of Ishinomaki did exactly what they had been told to do over generations. When the tsunami comes, climb up the hill. So I climbed up the same hill to try to grasp the situation 2 years earlier. It was truly frightening to realize that the waves had reached almost 20 meters. I left Japan impressed by the effort and work of recovery. But my visit was also a lesson on the urgency of reducing the risks for disasters. Japan is a lead model of disaster risk reduction, but even in this advanced country, the deadly combination of multiple hazards was overwhelming and catastrophic. And I'm sure that we all thought about this morning when we saw the news on television from Oklahoma, where evidently more than 90 people are dead, and of them 20 children at least in a school from the devastating hurricane. And I'm sure we all understand the pain and sorrow felt by families and friends. The same thing is for most economically developed countries, that they also have these challenges when nature strikes in such vehement way. But think then how much more dangerous the situation is in places where people are poor and living in fragile homes with insufficient water and health services. I was reminded of that in the Haiti disaster, for instance. Least developed and small island developing states face the added burden of climate change, high vulnerability and exposure to hazards. Salt water is entering freshwater sources in outlying islands, and the very existence of these islands is threatened. The risks are higher in poor countries and for poor people, but the strategies are the same. Everywhere on Earth, we reduce risks by identifying and addressing which factors drive the risks, and then ask ourselves what we can do about it. In this effort, we need to mobilize also the private sector. How they utilize and invest their resources can mean the difference between life and death. I'm therefore very glad there is such a strong private sector participation in this meeting today. I would strongly claim that business has a strong interest in disaster risk reduction. I saw this last month during a trip to Bangkok. Industrial areas had been badly hit by the flooding in 2011, and this was just one example of how disasters affect supply chains and markets. Forward-looking business leaders would know, I'm sure, that it pays to address and reduce risks. In Bangkok, I also saw the devastating effects of floods in the ancient capital city of Ayutthaya, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I was gratified to see that the Thai government is developing a flood risk mitigation plan for this historic city with support from the United Nations and the Asian Development Bank. Let me finally also make the case that disaster risk reduction is essential to reach the Millennium Development Goals. There can be no sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation if water sources and latrines are vulnerable to natural hazards. Hospitals and other community structures must be resilient if we are to reach the goals on health. And it is not acceptable that so many people die in disasters because of weak and neglected building standards. We have seen several such tragic disasters in recent times. The Hyogo Framework for Action has been a valuable guide for international cooperation. Now we must build on the achievements and address the gaps and challenges. Our meeting here in Geneva today is an opportunity to exchange ideas, build consensus, and mobilize, not least, political momentum ahead of the World Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, which will hopefully adopt a practical vision of disaster risk reduction for the future. This will guide our work in this area for decades to come. And you are laying the basis for that work here today. As you know, we are also now shaping a new global approach to sustainable development. Disaster risk reduction should be an important component in this work, as well as in the post-2015 development agenda. And I am proud to announce that the United Nations is now accelerating its support to countries through a joint plan of action to reduce disaster risk and to build resilience. This is our response to the midterm review of the Hyogo Framework for Action. We are committed to do everything we can to reduce the risks stemming from disasters in communities, nations, and in our world. I look forward to listening to you and building on your ideas and your initiatives in these common efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Marco Mukoso Hausiko, Deputy Prime Minister of Namibia, to make his remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, President of the Swedish Federation, Your Excellency, Madam former President of Finland, Mr. Deputy United Nations Secretary General, Madam Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the newly launched Global Assessment Report 2013 estimates that so far this century, direct economic losses from floods, earthquakes, and drought throughout the world is worth $2.5 trillion. This amount, in my opinion, is a reality represents the livelihoods of communities, economies, and many shattered hopes. This simply means that if economic losses by disaster continues at the current levels, global efforts to reduce poverty will be reversed. Thus, investing more to reduce current losses that affects public and household assets is a necessity, as indicated in the theme of this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the goals of the third session of the Global Platform in 2011 was to garner political will to reduce the risks of disasters. I believe our participation here today is testimony of a job well done. This gathering reminds us that the world is a global village What affects one affects all. Asia, as indicated earlier by other speakers, is currently facing cyclones, and parts of Southern Africa, heavy floodings, while others like Namibia are experiencing droughts and floods at the same time. I believe, Your Excellency, that Geneva is not very warm either. The fourth session of the Global Platform offers us a time to pause and look back at our achievements as a global disaster risk reduction family. The Hyogo Framework for Action on Disaster Risk Reduction has helped to change official mindsets in almost every country in the world, with the creation of 191 Hyogo Framework for Action focal points and 85 national platforms for disaster risk reduction. 56 countries, I am told, have now a national disaster loss databases. Since the Hyogo Framework for Action was introduced in 2005, 121 countries have enacted legislations to establish policies and legal frameworks for disaster risk reduction, indicating a clear shift from crisis management to more proactive risk reduction and safety. Your Excellencies, almost 140 countries are currently reviewing their progress against the Hyogo Framework for Action for 2012-2013. I am told that is up from 90 in 2007, and 106 countries have submitted reports that provide unique insights into the implementation of the Hyogo Framework for Action. The majority of countries claim to have made disaster risk reduction a national priority and to have stepped up their efforts to prepare for disasters. Regional and trans-boundary cooperation has also taken place. At the same time, we believe that we need to accelerate implementation areas not yet achieved. We need to continue to strengthen partnership and enhance our coordination at the global, regional, and sub-regional level. No single group or organization can address every aspect of disaster risk reduction. Thus, partnership across all sectors of society are essential to reduce disaster risks and build resilient communities and nations. The private sector, Your Excellency, represents a significant actor in reducing disasters and preventing risks. Their investment is an opportunity to build a more resilient planet. The Hyogo Framework for Action 2 will have to fill the gaps, as indicated earlier by other speakers, not implemented with the current framework. We believe that the smallest and the most remote village must be empowered to prevent disasters if we want to ensure sustainable development. Needless to say, Your Excellencies, that the Hyogo Framework for Action 2 will complement the post-2015 development agenda in minimizing losses. I want to conclude by indicating that there is a very strong message in the theme of this gathering, and that is that we are being told that we owe it to our children and our children's children to ensure that they will have a safer tomorrow. I thank you for your kind attention.
I now give the floor to the Honourable Mrs. Marisa Helena Nascimento Moraes, Minister of Home Affairs of Cape Verde, to make her remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Mr. President of Switzerland, distinguished members of the Bureau, the distinguished ministers and participants, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to express my condolences to the people who were the victims of the natural catastrophe yesterday. I very much wish them every courage on behalf of the government of Cape Verde and in my personal capacity. Having said that, allow me to compliment ISDR on organizing this event and to affirm that it is an honor for Cape Verde and also a responsibility to attend this fourth session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. The presence of so many countries, international organizations and regional organizations, representatives of civil society and the private sector, shows that this subject addressed at this forum is essential if we're to build a healthy future. The theme of this fourth platform is very opportune. It's to build a safer world and a resilient planet. This means that training of persons is essential, and that of local societies to increase the effectiveness and sustainability of populations at risk of disasters in our countries. The building of such capacities depends also on a number of components which require planning, determination, flexibility, and the capacity to share the experience gained from the past. In terms of the risks faced by countries and societies as a result, for example, of unplanned development and insufficient risk evaluation in economic policies and decision-making, the frequency of disasters is increasing. The human and social costs are incalculable, and the economic costs are enormous. The pressure for rapid economic growth and related factors all have an ever-increasing impact on this tendency. Quite apart from high-impact disasters, which are publicized at the world level, we should also not lose sight of local disasters which affect principally developing countries, as in the case of floods in Africa, and which contribute to impoverishment and have a negative effect on the capacity for economic growth of our countries. On this point, I'd like to emphasize the efforts made by ECOWAS and the African Union to help Africa and integrate these concerns into the agendas of different countries. Ladies and gentlemen, the developing countries, and particularly small island developing states, are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and to the risks induced by human action. Our archipelago of 10 islands, which has developed tourism as part of its development plan, is a country which is particularly vulnerable. Despite progress made, we continue to have economic and environmental vulnerability with irregular rainfall patterns, meaning a structural food deficit which has lasted for decades. Despite the benefits of economic development in our country, the expansion of the tourist sector has costs. Costs which, among other things, include excessive use of water, pollution, and the need for huge investment in infrastructure in the cities. Aware of these risks, we are developing priority strategies for development, including the mobilization of water with mitigating the risks of floods and ensuring food security, as well as developing other sectors which are of extreme importance. We hope that by 2020 we shall have a much better position with regard to pollution. Cape Verde shares the objectives of the Hyogo Framework for Action and is determined to be more active in building resilience and promoting the disaster risk reduction agenda at the local, national and regional level, integrating this into its development agenda. We're well aware of the urgent need for disaster reduction not to be simply addressed as a post-disaster response, but that to be addressed proactively with long-term preparation, not just government policies, but also at the level of communities, civil society, and in the private sector. It's essential then that we act at the level of communities to build such resilience, and in order to implement activities and programs at the local level to identify and prevent disaster risks, with particular attention to the most vulnerable social groups, introducing gender-sensitive approaches. This will significantly accelerate implementation of the Hyogo Framework of Action in our country. We believe that in this way we'll also be ensuring sustainable development and reducing poverty. Ladies and gentlemen, we are firmly convinced that disaster risk reduction needs to be seen as a priority, to be reflected in investing in risk identification, including the effect of climate change, setting up warning systems to prepare for their impact, and in building resilience. This investment will, of course, only be a tiny part of the resources that the impact and recovery from any disaster requires. On the other hand, in parallel, it will contribute to reducing poverty, ensuring adaptation to climate change, and sustainable development. Thank you very much for your attention.
I now give the floor to the Honourable Mrs. Nikki Kay, Minister of Civil Defence of New Zealand, to make her remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a privilege to be giving this address at this opening ceremony of the fourth session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. New Zealand has been challenged by the major recovery and rebuild of Canterbury, both in terms of scale and complexity. Our hearts go out to the people of Oklahoma as they come to terms with their loss from the devastating tornadoes last night. We have been rebuilding not just our infrastructure in New Zealand, but also our communities. For a small nation, losing 185 people, including foreign citizens, has been hard. But New Zealand has been able to respond well to the earthquakes because we've had 40 years developing and refining our systems. We also know that the situation could have been a lot worse if we had not invested in high building standards. Our approach to emergency management is based on building resilience through risk reduction and readiness, followed by response and recovery when disaster occurs. The focus is on managing the risks rather than the hazards. It starts at a community level with the premise that each community knows best both what their hazards are and how to respond to them. We were also fortunate to have kind offers of international assistance, and thank you again to all those countries, many represented here today, that reached out and assisted us at our time of need. The Canterbury earthquake event has been an unfolding sequence. Unlike a flood which eventually recedes, Canterbury has been hit by sizable aftershocks. They have not only tested the already damaged buildings, but have put considerable mental strain on our people. Our building code was already strong. This meant structures held up well. This also meant that many people could stay in their homes even though they were damaged. We have now designed a new model for the repair of horizontal infrastructure that will rebuild almost all of it inside 5 years. We've set out a bold plan to regenerate and rebuild the Christchurch city centre. We held our economy together with an emergency wage subsidy. This gave businesses time to reorganise and regroup, and it also kept people in employment to be able to survive. Our challenge is that the cost is $40 billion. This represents over 20% of our national GDP. We have invested in advance in earthquake science, and New Zealanders have taken out extensive insurance cover. This means we have strong foundations to fund our recovery. Looking to the future, we are focused on some key areas to improve emergency management systems, including improving our response for vulnerable people and the training of the volunteer workforce. To mitigate risks, we first need to have a strong understanding of them. New Zealand's seismic risk to buildings has been long understood, and building designs and structural codes have improved over time to reflect best practice. Newer building stock generally performed satisfactorily during the quakes, with only a few system and standards improvements needed. However, a legacy of older building stock poses significant risk within many urban centres. In terms of community participation, we have learned the importance of building upon existing community networks and involving and trusting communities to know both their environment and what works for them. We're exploring how to better harness social media to organise self-response, particularly in areas where communities are best placed to help themselves or where their needs do not match immediate response priorities. There are some amazing stories of how communities have come together in Canterbury, not only to support each other, but to take action. As Minister of Youth Affairs, I would like to recognise New Zealand's young people and how well they responded. In particular, I would like to acknowledge Sam Johnson, a student from Canterbury University, who organised a student volunteer army to help Cantabrians immediately after the earthquakes. This army was made up of informal groups who helped with non-life-saving tasks, in particular cleaning up liquefaction on streets and around homes. Looking forward in the post-quake landscape, an opportunity exists to do things differently and more collaboratively with young people. In terms of our recovery, 2 years in, we are very sensitive to the communities that are weary and eager to get on with their lives. We understand that central government has a responsibility to maintain the momentum of response to a disaster when the affected community's inbuilt resilience wears thin. In closing, I would like to talk about international collaboration. Our international development program draws on our domestic experience to help our Pacific and ASEAN neighbours. Through my Ministry of Civil Defence, we are proud to be investing in and building the capability of national disaster management officers in the Pacific. It is appropriate to design an emergency management system that is right for individual environments and countries. However, there are areas that are internationally relevant, such as science, where information and skills are transportable and can be shared. It is our desire, through the tragedy of Canterbury earthquakes, that other nations will be more resilient as a result of our investment and our contribution to risk reduction. That is why we are all here. This conference is an important opportunity for global leaders and their governments, non-government organisations, and technical experts to form relationships that will save lives. Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
I now give the floor to Mrs. Graciela Ortuzar, Major of Lampa, Chile, to make her remarks. Mrs. Ortuzar, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Distinguidas autoridades presentes,
Distinguished authorities present,
distinguidos y excelentes participantes de esta cuarta
distinguished
plataforma global
excellencies,
para la
participants
reducción de riesgo de
of
desastre.
this global risk reduction
Para mí
platform.
significa un verdadero
For me,
honor poder
it's a real
representar
honour
a
to
los
be able
gobiernos
to
locales.
represent local governments.
Somos más de 200
There are more
representantes
than
municipales
200
y de ciudades
municipal and
que hemos
city
estado
representatives
dialogando durante esta
who
jornada y más
have been
de 1.500
dialoguing within
las
today,
comunidades
and
y
over
gobiernos
500
locales
communities and
hemos
local
adherido
governments
a la campaña mundial
that have
para la
joined
resiliencia.
the global campaign for
Esto
resilience.
para nosotros
This,
constituye
for
un
us,
gran logro, así como
represents a great
valoramos
achievement,
y
as
agradecemos el espacio
does
que Naciones
the value
Unidas
and the gratitude that we would like to
marco de
express for the
acción de
space that the United
nos ha
Nations
asignado a los
within
gobiernos
the
locales
Hyogo
por lo
Framework
que
for Action have
significamos
given
y por lo que
us
hacemos
local
y lo que
authorities
significa
for what we
construcción
do
de
and for
resiliencia.
what building resistance actually means to
Particularmente en mi
us,
país,
particularly in
a
my own
partir
country.
del día 27 de
As
febrero
of
de
the
2010,
27th of February 2010, the date of our last
8.8 y
earthquake,
8.9,
8.8, 8.9
una verdadera
on the Richter
catástrofe
scale, we were able
en las
to,
regiones más grandes de
we
nuestro
actually
país.
experienced a major
Y por
catastrophe in the
Dios, nos ha
biggest regions of our
costado salir
countries,
adelante
and
y poder
we really
reconstruir
have
con el
struggled
gobierno de
to
Chile.
come
A
out of
pesar
it and
de que
to
está
fight on with the
nuestro
Chilean
ADN, tal
government.
vez,
In spite of it
está
being in
en
our
nuestro
DNA, if you like,
componente psicosocial,
and our
esta capacidad de
psychosocial
levantarnos y de
composition, this
enterarnos
ability to be able
cuando
to get
sufrimos
up and
alguna
brush ourselves
catástrofe
off
en Chile,
when we suffer a
porque es
catastrophe
característico
in
de
Chile,
enfrentar
because it's
terremotos,
very
grandes
typical of us to be able
terremotos,
to have to face
movimientos
major
y acciones
earthquakes,
de actividades volcánicas,
floods,
entre otros.
movements of land, volcanic
Pero sí,
activity,
hoy día debo
etc.
hablar en
But today,
representación de
I
todas las
should speak
regiones
representing
respecto del rol de los
all
gobiernos
regions
locales.
as regards the role
Primero,
of local government.
Creo necesario
First of all,
plantear
I think it's necessary to
los
put
problemas
forward
se
that
resuelven
problems
en y con las
should be
comunidades.
resolved with
Y somos
and amongst the
precisamente los
communities.
gobiernos locales,
And it's specifically
autoridades
local
elegidas
governments,
popularmente,
authorities that have
quienes
been
estamos
elected
más
by
cerca,
local
más
populations.
próximos
We are
a
the
la
ones that are
gente y a las
closest, we are the
comunidades. Por
closest
lo
people
tanto,
to
cuando
those
ocurre alguna
communities,
situación
and
de
therefore,
riesgo
when
o
there's
de
a risk
emergencia,
situation or
obviamente somos
emergency
los primeros en
situation,
estar en
obviously we are
contacto
also the
con
first
las
people
poblaciones
to
que han sido
actually
avasalladas,
contact
afectadas
and get
por
into
alguna
contact with these
situación
affected
de riesgo
populations
o
that have been
emergencia.
affected by these
Un
risk or
ejemplo,
emergency
en nuestra
situations.
comuna de
An
Lampa,
example
Chile,
on our commune of Lampa in
precisamente como
Chile
innovación para el
is
año 2013,
as regards innovation 2030 for 2013 within our risk reduction framework. The work that we're already carrying on a family basis is that since 2011 we believe, and we have actually been able to do it, that we feel that it's very necessary to actually strengthen the work together with different economic and social actors, civil actors within the community. Today, in 2013, we've been able to make progress in our program that's called My Family Prepares Itself, and we're now able to go into people's houses, people's homes, and to be able to work directly with the family unit as regards building active and daily resistance. Secondly, I feel that it's been very important the universal and global declarations have been very important, and I'd like to thank the international framework that has carried out an incredible amount of work that has allowed us to change our visions and to be able to plan our development in a different way. I would like to thank Margareta Wallström, who's an extraordinary woman from whom we have learned a great deal and who we've been able to listen to, and she's listened to us, and we've been able to work together with her working team, with her team of people that work together, and agreements and consensuses. And I feel that for this platform and for what's coming from 2014 onwards, I feel that it's important that we make progress as regards defining more specific and more concrete measures as regards what the generation of policies and national and local programs should look like, so that they incorporate resistance in a cross-cutting way in the different aspects of development, whether this is health, education, vulnerability, which is such an important variable that all of the distinguished speakers have mentioned. And I think that we also have to think of resistance and think of these resistance and these criteria when we think of risk reduction policies, and also on a territorial level. And in the third instance, I think we have to really emphasize the need for states, nations, continents and regions. We really need to urge them that we can actually include in legislative frameworks resilience as a concept can be included in their legislative framework, and it should be present in national policies. And I think that we should also incorporate the financial aspect. Laws should be dictated with their own funding, their own financing, and as a municipality and local government, we're very much accustomed to working on the basis of operations and concrete actions. When a problem arises within the community, we're very much accustomed to receiving different tasks and competencies that different countries through states and central institutions delegate to us. However, often local government, we lack the sufficient financial tools and the technical tools that we need to be able to be more effective in our work and in our management. And I would like to ask international strategy to come more into play in the international community, to come to more international agreements around themes that we've been discussing and dialoguing with local governments within different regions and across different continents. I think we have to invest in information and training for our municipal agents, for our municipal workers, to speak about optimizing resources and to think and act before and not just after a catastrophe takes place. And for this, we need to be able to train and educate our local workers and incorporate within this task study centres, investigation centres, universities, NGOs, so that they are able to give us statistical basis and continual study elements as regards risk management and risk analysis, so that we know what risks we're having to face. We need to be able to have the technological and scientific resources on a community and local level as well. We have to prioritise local government resources on this topic. Even if we have made progress as regards exchange and information and dialogue, in this type of dialogue, we feel that it's still necessary to continue deepening our knowledge, and we have to raise the different international and continental investments that we make to try and reduce global warming. And we feel and we believe that it's necessary to articulate and to integrate the trio of global warming, resilience and adaptation and sustainable development. Not work on these things in an isolated and separate way, but as a single integrated topic that allows us to have a more integrated global vision on the matter. In Latin America, mayors and mayoresses have contributed and together to work towards resilience and local development in the same way that we are still doing this in Biobío in Chile, in Santiago and in Valle del Citata. In the Arab countries, progress is being made in territorial planning, land use from the local governments in Vancouver. Local communities are being brought on board as regards resilience work, and within this new framework of action, post-Kyogo, we have to walk hand in hand with the United Nations to continue to build resistance in an articulated and coordinated way, but also from grassroots, where people and the communities are that the governments and states have to work alongside. And that's where we are, that's where local government is, that's where our grassroots teams are, from the basis of the society that on a daily basis are face-to-face working for people, with people, for the smile of a child whose life we save, for a responsible city, for a commune that wants to be, and not because of what's going to be left over from a catastrophe that's not been dealt with in a way that should have been with foresight. And in this way, with resiliency and in disaster risk reduction management, no one is an extra body. We're all necessary. We all need to work together. We're all key elements. And we need to collaborate and protect the planet and, of course, guarantee a friendlier and more safe world for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That concludes the official opening ceremony. A great thank you to all our opening speakers.